The candles in the great hall of Ashford House burned so bright that every diamond in the room threw back 100 points of light, and Eliza Marsh felt every one of those points land on her like small, cold needles. She stood near the tall windows in a plain gray gown, the only dress she owned that could be called suitable for a ball, and she knew without looking that the women around her were counting the missing jewels at her throat. A voice behind her whispered to a friend, not quietly enough. "Poor little mouse," someone said, wearing her mother's old curtains again. Laughter followed, soft and cutting, the kind that was never meant to be overheard, and always was. Eliza kept her chin level. She had learned long ago that the trick to surviving an evening like this was to look as though the words had never reached her ears at all. She was here because her aunt, Margaret Whitfield, had insisted that family duty required her presence, even though the invitation had come only because Margaret's late husband had once done a favor for Lord Ashford that could not decently be refused. Eliza had no fortune, no title, and no expectation of either. She had come to stand quietly in a corner, drink one glass of lemonade, and leave before midnight. The orchestra struck up a new set, and the crowd shifted like a tide pulling back from the shore, revealing the wide floor for dancing. Eliza pressed herself further into the shadow of a marble column, and watched the couples take their places, the men in dark coats, the women glittering like a field of struck matches. That was when the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the room seemed to catch its breath all at once. Julian Ashford, Duke of Rendell, entered without announcement, though none was needed. Every head turned. He was tall, dressed in unadorned black but for a single silver pin at his collar, and he moved through the parting crowd the way a ship moves through water that has no choice but to yield. Eliza had heard of him, of course. Everyone had. He was the most sought-after man in 3 counties, pursued by mothers on behalf of daughters, and rumored to be so tired of the chase that he had not danced at a single ball in over a year. Lady Constance Hartley, the reigning beauty of the season, had already positioned herself near the refreshment table, angled just so, her smile prepared like a weapon polished for use. The Duke did not look at Lady Constance. He did not look at the string of diamonds around the throat of Miss Winslow, nor the emerald set worn by the youngest Carow daughter, nor any of the dozen other women who had dressed that evening as though for battle. His gaze moved once across the room, slow and searching, and then stopped. It stopped on Eliza. She felt it before she understood it, the particular weight of being seen by someone who was not simply looking but truly looking, and she resisted the urge to glance behind her to check that he could not possibly mean her. There was no one behind her. There was only the cold marble column and the window beyond it, black with night. For a moment neither of them moved. The music swelled around them, indifferent to the strange stillness between a duke and a woman in a plain gray dress, and then he began to walk toward her. Whispers followed him like a current, quiet at first, then rising. Eliza saw heads turn one after another, saw Lady Constance's smile falter and then reset itself into something brittle, saw her aunt across the room go pale and then flush with what looked like panic. A young footman near the refreshment table nearly dropped his tray, so startled was he by the sight of the Duke crossing the entire length of the ballroom with such evident purpose. Eliza noticed even that small detail, because in the space of a few seconds, every ordinary motion in the room seemed to have paused to watch what was unfolding, as though the orchestra itself had softened its playing without quite meaning to. She thought, briefly and absurdly, of turning and slipping behind the marble column entirely, vanishing into the shadow the way she had vanished at a dozen gatherings before this one. But something in the steadiness of his approach told her that hiding would accomplish nothing at all, that whatever had caught his attention had already caught it fully, and no column in England would be wide enough to undo it now. Eliza's heart beat hard and fast, not with hope, but with dread. She had spent her whole life learning to be invisible in rooms like this, and invisibility had kept her safe. Whatever this was, it threatened to end that safety in front of everyone she had ever tried to avoid. He stopped before her and inclined his head, the gesture small but unmistakably respectful, the kind he had not offered to a single other woman that night. "Good evening," he said. His voice was low even, and carried none of the practiced charm she had expected from a man so admired. "I do not believe we have been introduced." Eliza dropped a careful curtsy, aware of every eye in the hall now fixed upon them like pins holding a moth to a board. "Eliza Marsh, Your Grace," she said, "niece to Mrs. Margaret Whitfield." He studied her for a moment longer than was polite, though there was nothing improper in his expression, only a kind of quiet attention she was not used to receiving. "You are not dancing," he observed. "No one has asked me," she answered honestly, because she had decided years ago that honesty cost less than pretending, even when pretending might have been kinder to herself. "Then allow me to correct that oversight," he said, and extended his hand. A ripple of astonishment moved through the nearest guests, quick as wind through wheat. Eliza hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her gloved hand in his, aware that refusing a duke in front of half the county would create far more talk than accepting. They took their places on the floor as the music began again, and Eliza was conscious of every gaze upon her back, sharp as the tips of knives. The duke, however, seemed entirely unconcerned by the attention. His focus settled wholly on her as though the rest of the ballroom had ceased to exist. "You dance well," he said, as they moved through the first turn. "I had a good teacher," she replied. "My father, before he died. He said a woman should never apologize for taking up space on a dance floor." "A wise man," the duke said, and something in his expression shifted, softened, as though the words had struck a place he had not expected to be struck that evening. "Do you attend many balls, your grace?" Eliza asked, largely to fill the silence that followed, though she found she was genuinely curious about the answer. "Fewer than my sister would prefer," he admitted. "She insists that a man of my position owes society at least one evening of dancing per season, though I confess I usually spend those evenings counting the minutes until I may reasonably excuse myself. Tonight, I find myself in no hurry to leave at all." Eliza felt her cheeks warm at the implication, though she kept her expression composed, having learned long ago that showing too much feeling in a crowded room only invited further scrutiny. "Perhaps your sister will finally be satisfied," she said lightly. "Perhaps," he agreed, "though I suspect she will have a great many questions for me before the night is through. Most of them concerning exactly who you are, and why I crossed an entire ballroom to find out." Across the room, Lady Constance watched with an expression that had abandoned all pretense of pleasantness. She turned to whisper something to the woman beside her, and though Eliza could not hear the words, she understood their shape well enough from years of practice. Something is wrong with this. Someone should stop it. Eliza did not know yet that she had become, in the space of one dance, the most talked-about woman in the room. She only knew that the Duke's eyes had not left her face since the moment their hands touched, and that for the first time and longer than she could remember, she did not feel invisible. When the music ended, he did not release her hand immediately. "Might I call upon your aunt tomorrow?" he asked, "so that I may properly request the pleasure of your company again." Eliza's breath caught. Behind the Duke's shoulder she could see her aunt watching with an expression somewhere between terror and disbelief, and beyond her, Lady Constance's narrowed eyes promising that this was far from finished. "Your Grace," Eliza said carefully, "I must ask you plainly. Is this some manner of jest among your friends? A wager, perhaps, to see how a duke might fluster a woman with no fortune to her name?" The question seemed to surprise him, and then, strangely, to please him. "No jest, Miss Marsh," he said. "I find I am rather tired of women who already know exactly what to say to a duke. You did not know, and you said it anyway. That is a rare thing." He bowed once more, precise and formal, and withdrew from the floor before she could form a reply, leaving her standing alone amid a hall full of eyes that had, until an hour ago, refused to see her at all. Her aunt reached her within seconds, gripping her arm with fingers cold and trembling. "Eliza," her aunt whispered, "what have you done?" "I only danced," Eliza said, though even as she spoke the words, she understood that something far larger than a single dance had begun, something she could not yet name, and something that would not, she suspected, allow her to return to invisibility ever again. Across the hall, Lady Constance had already begun to move through the crowd, gathering allies with her eyes, and Eliza felt, for the first time that evening, a genuine chill that had nothing to do with the open windows behind her. Margaret's grip on her arm tightened further as they made their way toward the edge of the hall, away from the curious eyes still lingering on Eliza's face. "We must leave soon," her aunt whispered. "Before anyone thinks to approach you with questions neither of us are prepared to answer tonight." Eliza nodded, though part of her wanted only to remain a moment longer, to hold on to the strange warmth that had settled over her during the dance before the cold reality of the ballroom's judgment returned in full. She glanced once more toward the far end of the hall, where the Duke now stood surrounded by a small circle of gentlemen offering what looked like teasing congratulations, and found, to her surprise, that he was not laughing along with them. He was looking back at her. The carriage ride home passed in near silence, Margaret too shaken to speak, and Eliza too full of unfamiliar feeling to trust her own voice. Only as they turned onto the narrow lane leading to their small house did her aunt finally speak again, her tone caught somewhere between wonder and dread. "Whatever happens next," Margaret said quietly, "you must promise me you will guard your heart carefully, Eliza. Men like the Duke live in a world that does not always deal kindly with women like us, however good their intentions may seem tonight." "I promise," Eliza said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt a small, stubborn hope taking root somewhere beneath her fear. refusing entirely to be reasoned away. The night was far from over, and she understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, that whatever came next would not be gentle. Eliza had not slept, and by the time the morning light reached her small room above her aunt's parlor, she had already convinced herself that the Duke would not come. Men like him made grand gestures at balls and forgot them by breakfast. She dressed plainly, as always, and went down to help with the household accounts, determined to put the entire strange evening behind her. She had barely opened the ledger when the sound of carriage wheels on gravel stopped her hand mid-motion. Her aunt appeared in the doorway, face white as chalk. "He is here," Margaret said. "The Duke of Rendell is at our door." Eliza's stomach dropped. She had not truly believed it would happen. Somehow believing had felt safer than the alternative, because if she had allowed herself to hope, and the carriage had passed by without stopping, the disappointment would have been unbearable. Now there was no time to prepare for either outcome. She rose, smoothed her plain morning dress with hands that were not quite steady, and followed her aunt to the small sitting room where the Duke of Rendell stood examining a modest painting on the wall as though it were the most fascinating object in England. "Your Grace," Eliza said, dropping into a curtsy. He turned, and something in his expression eased when he saw her, as though he had genuinely doubted whether she would agree to receive him at all. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I hope I have not called at an inconvenient hour." "Not at all," her aunt said quickly, far too quickly, gesturing toward the settee with the eager energy of a woman rearranging her entire understanding of the world in real time. "Please, do sit. I shall bring tea." Margaret fled the room with unusual speed, leaving Eliza alone with the Duke, the door properly ajar for propriety, though propriety felt like a thin and useless shield against the strange gravity of his presence. "I confess," Eliza said, once they were seated, "I did not expect you to actually come." "Why not?" he asked, and there was no offense in the question, only genuine curiosity. "Because men in your position rarely follow through on words spoken at a ball," she said. "There is often more sport in the saying than in the doing." He considered this for a moment, his dark eyes steady on hers. "Then you have known the wrong sort of men, Miss Marsh. Or perhaps the right sort simply never had reason to seek you out before." Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked down at her hands. "I have known very few men of any sort, Your Grace. My father died when I was 16, and since then it has been my aunt and myself against a world that does not care much for women without fortune." "I am sorry for your loss," he said, and the words carried a weight that suggested he understood loss himself, though he did not elaborate, and she did not ask. Tea arrived, along with Margaret, who hovered near the door pretending to arrange flowers that did not need arranging, clearly unwilling to leave her niece unsupervised with a Duke, yet equally unwilling to interrupt whatever was unfolding. "Your home is a good deal quieter than mine," the Duke observed, glancing around the modest sitting room, with what seemed to be genuine appreciation rather than polite condescension. "My own house is never without some steward or secretary requiring my attention. I find I rather envy the stillness here." "I imagine stillness feels different when it is chosen rather than required," Eliza said. "We are quiet because we have little occasion for callers, Your Grace, not because we prefer it above all else." "Perhaps," he said, "though I wonder whether a house need be grand to be content. I have visited a great many grand houses that were far from content, and I begin to suspect the two have less to do with each other than most of society believes." Margaret, still hovering near the flowers, made a small sound of surprise at this, quickly disguised as a cough, and Eliza had to look away to keep from smiling at her aunt's poorly concealed astonishment. The Duke turned the conversation with surprising ease, asking about her father, about the small house where she had grown up, about the books she preferred and whether she found the county assemblies as tedious as he did. Eliza found herself answering honestly, more honestly than she had answered anyone in years, because there was something in his manner that did not seem to be searching for the correct response, only for the true one. "You do not ask me about my title," he observed at one point, watching her over the rim of his teacup. "Should I?" she asked. "Everyone else does, eventually," he said. "Sometimes within the first minute. It becomes rather predictable." Eliza considered this. "I suppose I already know you have a title, Your Grace. I was more curious whether you preferred your tea with sugar or without, since that seemed a more useful thing to learn about a person." For the first time since she had met him, the Duke laughed. A real laugh, low and startled out of him, as though he had not expected to be surprised twice in 1 week by the same woman. "Without," he said, "though I confess I have never been asked that question before yours." The visit lasted the better part of an hour, and when he finally rose to take his leave, he asked whether she would accompany him to a small garden gathering being held at Lord Ashworth's estate 3 days hence, an informal affair, far smaller than the ball, where perhaps conversation might continue without quite so many eyes upon them. Eliza hesitated. Your Grace, forgive me, but I must ask again. Are you certain of what you are doing? Society will speak of nothing else. Lady Constance alone will make a project of destroying whatever this is before it becomes anything at all. Let her try, he said simply, and something in the quiet steadiness of his voice told Eliza he meant it entirely. After he left, Margaret sank into a chair as though her legs could no longer hold her. Eliza, she said, this cannot be real. A duke does not call upon a woman with no dowry and ask her to garden parties. There will be consequences. People will say terrible things. People already say terrible things about me, Eliza said quietly. At least now they will have a reason. But the words did not comfort either of them, and over the following 3 days, Eliza found the truth of her aunt's warning proven again and again. She could not walk to the market without catching whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she passed. A note arrived, unsigned, warning her to remember her place before she embarrassed herself further. Another guest from the ball, a distant acquaintance named Charlotte Bennet, visited under the pretense of friendship, only to spend the entire hour asking pointed questions about what exactly Eliza imagined she was doing, chasing a man so far above her station. I am not chasing anyone, Eliza told her, keeping her voice level though her hands trembled in her lap. He called upon me. I did not seek him out. Charlotte's smile did not reach her eyes. Of course, she said, though I wonder how long his interest will survive contact with reality. Men like the Duke grow bored quickly, Miss Marsh. Do try not to lose your heart before he loses his amusement. Eliza said nothing more, but the words lodged themselves somewhere beneath her ribs and stayed there, a small, cold seed of doubt she could not quite dislodge no matter how she tried. On the morning of the garden gathering, she dressed in her one good day dress, pale yellow with simple trim, and told herself firmly that she expected nothing beyond pleasant conversation. She would not allow herself to hope for more, because hope, she had learned, was the most expensive thing a poor woman could afford to lose. The Duke's carriage arrived precisely on time, and he handed her down himself rather than allowing his footman to do it, a small gesture that nonetheless drew stares from the other guests already gathered on Lord Ashworth's lawn beneath white pavilions and trailing roses. Lady Constance was there, of course, dressed in pale blue silk, surrounded by a small court of admirers, and her eyes tracked Eliza's arrival with the sharp, assessing look of a hawk that has just spotted something small and unprotected moving through open grass. You came, the Duke said quietly, as they walked together along the garden path, putting distance between themselves and the main crowd. I said I would, Eliza answered. Most people say a great many things they do not mean, he said. I find I am beginning to trust that you are not most people. They walked further, past hedgerows trimmed into careful shapes, past a small fountain where sparrows bathed and scattered at their approach, and Eliza felt, for the first time since the ball, something like ease settle over her, as though the Duke's presence created its own small quiet world, separate from the sharp eyes and sharper tongues waiting just beyond the hedge. Tell me something true about yourself that no one at that ball would guess, he said suddenly, as they paused beside a bed of late roses. Eliza considered this for a long moment. I once wished to travel, she admitted. Not far, only to the coast, to see the sea for the first time. My father promised to take me the summer before he died, and somehow I have never quite let go of the wish, even though there is little chance of it ever being fulfilled now. Then it shall be fulfilled, he said simply, as though the matter required no further discussion at all. You cannot simply declare such things, Your Grace, she said, half laughing despite herself. The sea does not appear because a duke wishes it to. No, he agreed, smiling properly now, a rare and unguarded expression that changed his whole face. But a duke may arrange a great many things that once seemed impossible, given sufficient reason to try. Consider it a small promise, Miss Marsh, one I intend to keep regardless of how improbable it seems to you today. May I ask you something honest? He said, stopping beside the fountain. Always, she said. Does it frighten you? He asked. All of this attention, all of this talk. Eliza considered lying, considered offering the composed answer that would please him, and then remembered her own rule about honesty costing less in the long run. Yes, she said, it frightens me a great deal, not because of what people say about me, but because I do not yet understand what you want from me, Your Grace, and until I understand that, I cannot know how much of myself it is safe to give away. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, watching the sparrows return cautiously to the fountain's edge. That is, he said finally, the most honest thing anyone has said to me in this garden in longer than I can remember. They continued walking, the conversation drifting easily from the sea to books to the small, ordinary details of childhood, and Eliza found herself sharing memories she had not spoken aloud in years, the sound of her father's laugh, the smell of the bakery near their old house, the particular blue of a coat he had worn until the elbows wore through. The Duke listened as though every detail mattered, asking questions that showed he had truly heard what came before, rather than merely waiting for his turn to speak. And Eliza began to understand why society found him so unusual. Most men of his rank, in her limited experience of them, spoke primarily of themselves, their estates, their opinions, expecting a woman's role to be little more than attentive silence. Julian, she noticed she had already begun thinking of him by name, though she had not yet been given leave to use it, seemed genuinely more interested in drawing her out than in filling the space with his own importance. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, a bell rang somewhere near the main pavilion, signaling that refreshments were being served, and the Duke offered his arm to walk her back toward the gathered crowd. "I confess I am reluctant to return," he said quietly. "Out there we become a spectacle again, watched and discussed. Here, we were simply two people speaking honestly." "Perhaps that is worth guarding carefully," Eliza said. "Then, the honesty, regardless of how many eyes eventually find us." He looked at her then with an expression she could not quite name, something between admiration and quiet resolve, as though she had given him a piece of wisdom he intended to carry with him well beyond that afternoon. As they emerged from the garden path back into view of the main lawn, several heads turned immediately toward them, conversations pausing mid-sentence, and Eliza felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came from being watched by people who had already decided, long before this moment, exactly what story they wished to tell about her. Lord Ashworth himself approached to greet the Duke, drawing him briefly into conversation about a matter of estate business, and Eliza found herself standing alone for a moment near the edge of the lawn, an experience that would have once felt like relief, and now felt strangely hollow after an afternoon of such easy company. The letter arrived on a gray morning, slipped under the door so quietly that Eliza did not hear it come, and when she found it on the hallway floor, the handwriting on the front meant nothing to her at all. She broke the seal expecting some ordinary correspondence, and found instead 6 lines that made her blood turn cold. "Miss Marsh," it read, "you would do well to remember that men of rank amuse themselves with women of no consequence, and discard them just as easily. The Duke has done this before. Ask around before you make a fool of yourself in front of all of England." There was no signature, but Eliza did not need one to guess the source. She folded the paper carefully and sat down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly despite her effort to remain calm. Her aunt found her there an hour later, still staring at the folded letter, as though it might rearrange itself into something less cruel if she looked at it long enough. "What is that?" Margaret asked, and when Eliza handed it over without a word, her aunt's face grew tight with anger. "This is Lady Constance's doing, I am certain of it, or one of her friends, acting on her behalf. I do not know what to believe anymore," Eliza admitted. "Perhaps it is true. Perhaps he has done this before, called upon some other woman, made her hope for something, and then vanished when the novelty wore thin." "You must ask him directly," Margaret said. "Better to know the truth from his own mouth than to poison yourself with rumors written by an anonymous coward." "But what if the letter speaks truth?" Eliza said, voicing the fear she had been circling all morning. "What if I ask and he confirms it, and I am left having chased away the one honest thing that has happened to me in years, simply because I could not bear a moment of uncertainty?" Margaret took her hand across the table, her grip firm despite her own evident worry. "Then better to know it now," she said, "than to build a life around a man who has deceived you once already, and would likely do so again. You deserve better than living in fear of a truth you have not yet had the courage to ask for." Eliza nodded slowly, though the knot in her stomach did not loosen. She spent the remainder of the morning attempting to occupy herself with the household accounts, but the numbers blurred together meaninglessly, her mind circling back again and again to the 6 cruel lines folded in her pocket. Eliza knew her aunt was right, but the thought of asking such a question terrified her more than the letter itself. To ask meant admitting how much she had already begun to hope, and hope, once spoken aloud, could not be taken back. She did not have long to wait for the opportunity. That very afternoon, the Duke called again, this time bringing with him a small bundle wrapped in brown paper, which he presented to her with an unusual awkwardness that did not suit his usual composure. "I thought of you when I saw it," he said, as she unwrapped a slim volume of poetry, its pages worn soft with age. "It belonged to my mother. I do not often part with things that belong to her, but I thought you might understand it better than most." Eliza ran her fingers over the cracked spine, moved despite herself, and then, before her courage could fail her, she asked the question that had haunted her since morning. "Your Grace," she said, "forgive me, but I must ask you something difficult. Have you done this before? Called upon a woman, raised her hopes, only to lose interest once the season moved on?" The Duke's expression shifted, not with anger, but with something closer to old and quiet pain. He set down his teacup carefully before answering. "2 years ago," he said, "I was engaged to a woman named Charlotte Ellery. She was beautiful, clever, and I believed she loved me. I later learned, through a letter not unlike whatever you likely received this morning, that she had been counting the months until she could claim my title, while quietly maintaining an understanding with another man of greater fortune, one who could offer her more than a duke's affection alone. When I confronted her, she did not even deny it. She simply asked why I was surprised, since everyone married for advantage eventually." Eliza said nothing, letting him continue. "Since then," he said, "I have watched women approach me with the same calculation in their eyes, weighing my title against their ambitions, and I grew so tired of it that I stopped attending balls at all, until my sister insisted I appear at Ashworth's this season. I did not expect to find anyone different, and then I saw you, standing apart from everyone, wearing no jewels, expecting nothing, and I recognized something I had not seen in a very long time, someone who was not calculating anything at all." "So the rumor is partly true," Eliza said quietly. "You were engaged before, but you did not vanish from her life without cause. She gave you cause." "She did," he said, "and I understand now why someone might wish you to hear only half of that story, and let you draw your own frightened conclusions from it." "Did you love her?" Eliza asked quietly, needing to know though she feared the answer might sting more than she expected. "I believed I did, at the time," he said, after a pause. "Looking back, I wonder whether I loved the idea of her more than the woman herself, since I understood so little of what lay beneath her charm until the deception was already laid bare in front of me. It taught me a hard lesson about the difference between admiration and true knowing of a person." "And what is the difference?" she asked. "Admiration requires only a pleasing surface," he said. "True knowing requires seeing someone clearly, faults and fears included, and choosing them regardless. I did not know Charlotte Ellery in that deeper sense, not truly. I fear I mistook her polish for her character, and paid dearly for the mistake." Eliza felt something loosen in her chest, a tightness she had not fully acknowledged until it began to ease. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she said. "I would rather have painful honesty than comfortable silence." "That," he said, watching her with quiet intensity, "is precisely why I cannot seem to stay away from you, Miss Marsh." The visit ended too soon, as all their visits seemed to, and after he departed, Eliza sat with the book of poetry in her lap for a long while, turning the pages slowly, feeling the weight of a story that was no longer simple gossip, but something with real shape and real sorrow behind it. She did not know that across town, Lady Constance was receiving a very different sort of visitor. Charlotte Ellery, the very woman the Duke had spoken of, had returned to society that season after her own engagement to the wealthier suitor had ended in scandal and disappointment, her fortune spent, and her reputation dimmed. She arrived at Lady Constance's townhouse with an expression of practiced sympathy, though her eyes carried something sharper underneath. "I hear the Duke has found himself a new distraction," Charlotte said, settling into a chair without waiting to be invited to sit. "Some penniless girl with no name to speak of." Lady Constance's mouth curved into something not quite a smile. "She will not last," she said. "He tires of everyone eventually. I only need to help him tire of her a little faster than he otherwise might." "And why should that concern me?" Charlotte asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "Because," Lady Constance said, leaning forward, "if this girl succeeds where you failed, it will remind all of society exactly how the Duke came to be free in the first place. Better for both of us if she disappears quietly and the old story stays forgotten." Charlotte considered this, turning a ring on her finger, the very ring that had once belonged to another failed engagement. "What do you propose?" she asked. Lady Constance's smile widened, cold and precise. "A rumor is a fragile thing," she said, "but a well-placed truth twisted just slightly out of shape can do far more damage than any lie. I understand Miss Marsh has been receiving gifts from the Duke, a book, I am told, that once belonged to his late mother." Charlotte's eyes narrowed with interest. "Imagine," Lady Constance continued, "if it were suggested that Miss Marsh had asked for that gift specifically, had angled for it, had perhaps even hinted that she required compensation for her attentions, the way certain women of limited means sometimes do when courting men of fortune. It would not need to be true. It would only need to sound plausible enough for the wrong ears to repeat it. That is a dangerous game, Charlotte said, though there was no reluctance in her voice, only calculation. All games worth playing are dangerous, Lady Constance replied. The question is only whether you have the stomach to play alongside me, or whether you intend to spend the rest of the season watching from the sidelines while a nobody in a gray dress takes everything you once had within reach. And if this fails, Charlotte asked, if the Duke discovers what we have done and it comes back upon us both, what then? My name has already suffered one scandal this year. I am not certain it could survive a second. Lady Constance waved a dismissive hand, though something flickered briefly behind her composed expression. A shadow of doubt quickly smothered. It will not fail, she said. Servants gossip, rumors spread, and by the time anyone thinks to trace the story back to its source, it will have taken on a life entirely its own, repeated by a dozen mouths that never once spoke with either of us. We need only whisper it once, in the right ear, and let the county do the rest of the work for us. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, and then she nodded slowly. Tell me what you need me to say, she said, and to whom. Over the following days, the whispers began to shift in tone and detail. No longer simple gossip about an unlikely courtship, but something with sharper edges. Suggestions that Eliza Marsh had been seen requesting expensive gifts, that she had once been overheard boasting to a servant about the fortune she intended to secure, that her poverty had made her desperate enough to manipulate a grieving duke through his memories of his mother. A shopkeeper who had once greeted Eliza warmly now offered only a stiff nod when she entered his store, his eyes following her with open suspicion as she selected thread for her aunt's mending. A woman she had known casually for years crossed the street rather than pass close enough to exchange greetings, an act of small cruelty that stung far more than Eliza expected it to, given how little the woman's opinion had ever mattered to her before that week. Even the local vicar's wife, a woman known throughout the parish for her charitable kindness, made a point of asking pointed questions about Eliza's character during a chance encounter after church, questions phrased delicately but carrying an unmistakable edge of doubt beneath their politeness. Eliza answered as honestly as she could, though she left the conversation feeling as though she had been quietly weighed and found wanting by someone she had always considered fair-minded. Within 2 days, the story had traveled from Lady Constance's drawing room to the milliner's shop, from the milliner's shop to the churchyard after Sunday service, growing sharper details with every retelling, the way a snowball gathers mass rolling down a hill. By the time it reached the ears of the Whitfield household, it bore only a passing resemblance to the truth, transformed into something calculated and unkind that Eliza scarcely recognized as connected to herself at all. Eliza first heard the rumor from her aunt, who returned from the market pale and shaking, having overheard 2 women discussing it outside the baker's shop as though it were common knowledge. They are saying you asked him for that book, Margaret said, her voice tight with fury and fear in equal measure. That you begged for it, that you have been asking servants about his fortune, his properties, his income. Eliza, none of this is true. Of course it is not true, Eliza said, though a cold dread was already spreading through her chest at the speed with which the story had grown teeth. But it does not matter whether it is true. It only matters whether people choose to believe it. She thought of the anonymous letter, of the careful cruelty behind it, and understood with sudden clarity that this was not random gossip drifting through idle conversation. This was constructed, deliberate, aimed with precision at the exact vulnerability she had confessed to no one but the Duke himself, the fear that she did not yet understand what he wanted from her, and that the world would never allow her the simple dignity of being believed. She sat down and wrote to him that same evening, her hand steady despite the storm inside her, informing him only that troubling rumors had begun to circulate and that she thought he should hear of them from her directly, before they reached him twisted through someone else's mouth. His reply came the following morning, brief but resolute. I have already heard whispers of it, he wrote. Do not trouble yourself further tonight. I intend to learn exactly where these stories began, and I do not believe, Miss Marsh, that their source will prove difficult to find. Eliza folded the letter and pressed it against her chest, grateful for his certainty even as her own remained shaken, because she understood now that whoever had begun this campaign against her would not stop with one letter and one rumor. Lady Constance had shown, in the space of a single conversation overheard through a garden hedge, exactly how far she was willing to go, and Eliza suspected that the worst of it had not yet arrived. That night, unable to sleep, Eliza sat by her window watching the moon rise slowly over the rooftops of the town, turning over every unkind word she had overheard that week, every sideways glance from women who had once ignored her entirely and now found her suddenly fascinating in the worst possible way. She thought of her father, of the quiet strength he had tried to instill in her before his death, and wondered whether he could have imagined his daughter's name spoken so cruelly in drawing rooms she had never even entered. Margaret found her there near midnight, still awake, and sat beside her without a word for a long while, simply offering the comfort of shared silence rather than empty reassurance. "They cannot take from you what you refuse to give them," Margaret said finally. "Your composure, your honesty, your good name in your own eyes. Let them whisper whatever cruel inventions please them. You know the truth of your own conduct, and so, now, does the Duke." Eliza rested her head against her aunt's shoulder, drawing what strength she could from the small, steady comfort of family, in a week that had otherwise offered her very little softness. "But knowing the truth does not stop the whispering," she said quietly, "and I fear it will take more than the Duke's certainty to end it, before it does lasting harm to us both." Margaret had no answer for that, and the two women sat together in the quiet dark, neither one yet aware of exactly how far Lady Constance intended to carry her scheme before the season's gossip finally ran its course. The knock at the door came sharper and louder than any polite visitor would offer, and when Eliza opened it, she found her cousin Henry standing on the step, his face flushed with anger, and his hat clutched too tightly in his hand. "Do you know what they are saying about you at the club?" he demanded, pushing past her into the small entryway without waiting for an invitation. "Men I have never met are asking whether my own cousin schemes to trap dukes with sentimental trinkets." I had to sit and listen to it, Eliza, as though it were common knowledge. Eliza's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice level. "It is not true, Henry. None of it." "That may be so," he said, dropping into a chair uninvited. "But true or not, it is spreading faster than fire through dry grass, and it is beginning to attach itself to our family name as well as yours. Aunt Margaret's reputation, mine, all of it dragged through the mud, because you caught the eye of a man who should have known better than to notice a woman without a fortune. The unfairness of it struck her like a blow, sharper somehow coming from family than from strangers. I did not ask for his attention," she said, her voice rising despite her effort to remain composed. "I did not seek this out, Henry. I have done nothing but answer honestly when he chose to speak with me." Henry's expression did not soften. "Then perhaps you should discourage him," he said, "before this ruins us all." "You speak as though I invited this attention deliberately," Eliza said, her voice sharpening despite her effort to remain calm. "As though I somehow arranged for a duke to notice me across a crowded ballroom, simply to inconvenience you at your club." "I did not say that," Henry replied, though his tone suggested he had at least entertained the thought before arriving. "I only say that whatever you intended or did not intend, the consequence falls upon all of us equally, and I would ask that you consider that before allowing this courtship to continue any further." Margaret entered at that moment, having heard raised voices from the kitchen, and placed herself firmly between them. "That is quite enough," she said to her nephew. "Eliza has done nothing wrong, and I will not have her blamed in her own home for the cruelty of jealous women with too much time and too little kindness." Henry rose, clearly unwilling to argue further with his aunt, though his expression remained unconvinced. "I only wish to protect this family's name," he said stiffly. "I hope you will both remember that, whatever comes of this business." Henry left shortly after, still unconvinced, and Eliza sat alone in the parlor for a long while afterward, feeling the weight of an entire season's worth of judgment pressing down upon her chest, heavier with every hour that the rumor was allowed to breathe unchecked. The Duke arrived the following afternoon, and Eliza saw immediately from the set of his jaw that he had spent the intervening days doing precisely what he had promised, tracing the rumor back toward its source. "I have found where it began," he said, without preamble, seating himself across from her, with barely contained anger visible beneath his controlled exterior. "A servant in Lord Ashworth's household overheard Lady Constance and a woman named Charlotte Ellery discussing the details before the story ever reached the wider town. The servant, fortunately, has agreed to speak on the matter, though quietly, since she fears losing her position." He paused, watching her carefully, as though weighing how much of his anger she could bear to witness before it became too much. "I have known Lady Constance for several years, in the ordinary way that county families know one another," he continued. "I never imagined her capable of such deliberate cruelty, though I confess I never gave her much thought at all beyond polite acknowledgement at gatherings. It seems I underestimated exactly how far wounded pride might carry a person." Eliza's hands tightened in her lap. "Charlotte Ellery," she repeated. "The woman you told me of." "The very same," he confirmed. "It seems her fortunes have suffered since her own engagement failed, and Lady Constance has found in her a willing accomplice, one who understands precisely how much damage a carefully placed lie can do to a woman with no name to protect her." Eliza looked down at her hands, feeling something between relief and exhaustion settle over her. "At least now we know," she said quietly, "though I confess I do not know what good it does us, since proof gathered quietly from a frightened servant will hardly silence a rumor that has already reached every drawing room in the county. The Duke leaned forward, his eyes steady on hers. I did not come only to tell you what I had learned, he said. I came because I believe the time has arrived to answer this publicly, in a manner that leaves no room for further whispering. What do you propose? She asked, though something in his tone had already begun to steady the tremor of fear that had lived in her chest for days. There is a dinner at Lord Ashworth's home in 4 days, he said, a gathering of considerable size, including both Lady Constance and Miss Ellery, along with most of the same society that has spent this week repeating their invention as though it were established fact. I intend to speak plainly there, before all of them, and I would ask you to stand beside me while I do it. Eliza felt fear rise sharp and sudden in her throat. To stand before that entire room, she said, and be looked at as though I were on trial, while they wait to see whether I flinch. I would not ask it of you if I did not believe you capable of it, he said gently, and I will not leave your side for a moment while it happens. But I understand if the thought is more than you wish to bear. I would find another way, if you asked me to. Eliza sat in silence for a long moment, weighing fear against the alternative, which was to remain quietly at home while her name continued to be dragged through drawing rooms she would never even enter, judged by faces she would never see. She thought of her father, and the words he had told her about never apologizing for taking up space, and she thought too of the anonymous letter still folded in her writing desk, cold proof of just how far cruelty was willing to travel when it believed itself unopposed. She thought of the shopkeeper's stiff nod, the vicar's wife's careful questions, the woman who had crossed the street rather than greet her, and understood that each small cruelty had been a rehearsal for something larger, a slow tightening of a net that would only grow tighter the longer she allowed it to go unanswered. She thought too of her father, of his insistence that a woman need never apologize for the space she occupied, and found in the memory a steadiness she had not expected to locate so quickly. There is also the matter of Charlotte Ellery, the Duke added, watching her expression carefully. I understand she has grown uneasy about her role in this scheme, now that the servant's testimony threatens to expose it. It is possible she may be persuaded to admit her part publicly, if approached correctly, which would remove any doubt at all about where the fault truly lies. Would she confess so easily? Eliza asked, surprised. Fear is a powerful persuader, he said. She has far less to lose by admitting a mistake made under Lady Constance's influence than by being discovered lying to protect a woman who will abandon her the moment it becomes convenient to do so. I intend to speak with her privately before the dinner, and give her the chance to choose which version of herself she wishes society to remember. I will come, she said finally. I would rather stand and be seen than hide and be erased. Something shifted in the Duke's expression then, admiration mixed with something warmer, something he did not yet name aloud, though Eliza felt its presence all the same. There is one more matter, he said, more quietly now. I do not intend simply to defend you against a rumor. I intend to make my intentions plain to all of society, so that no one may again mistake the nature of my attention toward you, nor imagine that it might be withdrawn should the wind of gossip blow hard enough. Eliza's breath caught. Your Grace, she said carefully, you must not act rashly out of anger on my behalf. Whatever declaration you are considering should not be forced by Lady Constance's cruelty. It should come, if it comes at all, because you have chosen it freely, not because you have been cornered into it. I have thought of little else these past several nights, he said, and I promise you, Miss Marsh, nothing about my intention has been forced from me by anyone. Lady Constance has only made me impatient to say aloud what I already knew to be true. Eliza did not ask him to explain further, though her heart beat hard and fast against her ribs, because she understood, without needing the words spoken outright, exactly what manner of declaration he meant to make. After he departed, Eliza remained in the parlor for a long while, turning his words over in her mind, half disbelieving and half terrified that she had allowed herself to hope for something so far beyond what she had ever imagined possible for a woman in her position. She thought of the countless women in the county who would have given a great deal to stand where she now stood, and wondered, not for the first time, whether she truly possessed the courage this moment demanded of her. Margaret found her still sitting there an hour later, the tea grown cold beside her, and did not need to ask what had passed between her niece and the Duke to recognize the particular quality of Eliza's silence. He means to marry you, Margaret said quietly, more statement than question. I believe so, Eliza admitted, though he has not said the words plainly, not yet. And what do you feel? Margaret asked, settling into the chair across from her. Eliza considered the question honestly before answering. Terrified, she said, not of him, but of everything that stands between where I am now and wherever this might lead. Terrified that Lady Constance will find some new cruelty before I have the chance to prove her wrong. Terrified that I might fail him, or myself, in front of everyone watching. That is not the same as doubt, Margaret observed gently. No, Eliza agreed, a small, unexpected smile finding its way onto her face despite the day's difficulties. It is not the same as doubt at all. That evening, word reached Lady Constance through one of her many informants that the Duke had been seen entering the Whitfield residence again, and that a servant from Ashworth's household had been quietly questioned about a private conversation overheard several days prior. She is not as friendless as we believed, Charlotte Ellery said, when the news reached her that same night, her voice tight with the particular fear of someone who understood exactly how quickly a scheme could unravel once its threads were pulled. Lady Constance's composure did not crack, though something colder settled behind her eyes. Then we shall simply need to ensure, she said, that whatever the Duke intends to say at Ashworth's dinner arrives too late to matter, because by then, all of society will already believe precisely what we have told them to believe. What more can we possibly add? Charlotte asked, unease creeping into her voice for the first time since the scheme began. Lady Constance smiled, thin and sharp as a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. We shall simply need to ensure that Miss Marsh does not arrive at that dinner with her reputation, or her composure, fully intact, she said. A woman frightened enough to falter in front of a crowded room does more damage to herself in 5 minutes than we could accomplish in 5 weeks of careful whispering. Charlotte said nothing further, though the unease in her expression did not fade, and long after she had left Lady Constance's townhouse that evening, she found herself standing at her own window, staring out at the darkened street, turning over the growing sense that she had aligned herself with someone far more ruthless than she had first understood, and far less likely to protect her should the scheme unravel around them both. Outside, the evening had turned cold and still, the calm before whatever storm Lady Constance intended to summon for the dinner still 4 days away, and neither Eliza nor the Duke yet understood exactly how far their enemy was prepared to go before she considered herself defeated. The morning of the dinner, a second letter arrived at the Whitfield household, and this one did not bother with subtlety at all. It named Eliza directly as a fortune hunter who had schemed her way into a grieving Duke's affections, claimed she had once been dismissed from a previous household for dishonesty, and warned that any woman foolish enough to appear at Ashworth's table that evening would find herself publicly humiliated before she ever reached the soup course. Eliza read it twice, her hands cold despite the warmth of the kitchen fire, and then set it down carefully on the table as though it might burn her fingers if she held it too long. This is not gossip anymore, Margaret said, reading over her shoulder with a look of genuine fear. This is a threat, Eliza. Whoever is behind this means to destroy you tonight, in front of everyone. I know, Eliza said quietly. Then perhaps you should not go, Margaret said. Send word that you are unwell. Let the Duke fight this battle without you standing in the center of it. Eliza turned the idea over in her mind, tempted for one long moment by the safety of simply staying home, of letting the storm pass over a room she had never entered rather than standing directly beneath it. But she thought of the letter's cruel confidence, the assumption baked into every line that she would be too frightened to appear at all, and something hardened in her chest that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with refusing to hand her enemies exactly the victory they expected. If I do not go, she said slowly, then every word in this letter becomes true in the minds of everyone who hears I stayed away. They will say I was too ashamed to face them, too guilty to defend myself. I would rather stand in that room and let them see my face, whatever they intend to throw at me, than spend the rest of my life known only as the woman who ran. Henry arrived shortly before noon, having heard word of the letter through some channel. Eliza did not trouble herself to ask about, and to her surprise, his earlier hostility had softened into something closer to concern. Whatever I said before, he told her, standing awkwardly in the doorway, I did not mean for it to invite this. No one deserves threats delivered through an anonymous hand. If you intend to attend tonight, I would ask to accompany you as well, if only to ensure you are not left standing alone should things turn difficult. Eliza studied her cousin's face, searching for the calculation she half expected to find there, and found instead something that looked like genuine, if belated, family loyalty. Thank you, Henry, she said quietly. I would welcome that. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though her voice remained steady. Then I shall come with you, she said. You will not stand there alone. That evening, Eliza dressed with more care than she had ever given a gown before, not because she wished to compete with the diamonds and silks that would fill Ashworth's dining hall, but because she understood that every eye in the room would be searching her for the smallest sign of weakness, and she intended to give them none. She wore the same simple gray she had worn to the very first ball, a quiet, deliberate choice, a reminder to herself and to anyone watching that she had never once pretended to be something she was not. The Duke met her carriage himself outside Ashworth's grand entrance, and something in his expression, tight with barely restrained anger, told her he too had heard of the letter's contents. "I received a copy as well," he said quietly, offering his arm. "Delivered anonymously to my own townhouse this morning, clearly intended to reach me before this evening, so that I might reconsider my intentions before I had the chance to declare them." "And did it work?" Eliza asked, searching his face. "It only confirmed everything I already suspected about the character of whoever sent it," he said, "and everything I already knew about yours, since you stand here beside me despite it." They entered the dining hall together, and Eliza felt the room's attention land on her, like the opening of 100 small doors, all at once, all watching. Lady Constance sat near the head of the table, resplendent in deep red silk, her expression carefully arranged into polite welcome that did not reach her eyes. Beside her, Charlotte Ellery offered the faintest smile, the kind that promised nothing good. Lord Ashworth greeted them both warmly at the entrance, offering no indication of the storm he likely suspected was coming, and guided them toward seats near the middle of the long table, close enough to Lady Constance that avoiding her entirely would prove impossible, but not so close as to appear a deliberate provocation. Eliza noticed Charlotte Ellery seated near the far end, considerably paler than she remembered from the ball, her eyes darting nervously toward the door each time it opened, as though expecting some disaster to arrive before the soup course had even been cleared away. Whatever confidence Charlotte had carried into this scheme, it appeared to have thinned considerably in the days since. Dinner began with strained pleasantries, the kind of conversation that skated carefully around the subject every guest at the table was secretly desperate to discuss, until Lady Constance, waiting for precisely the right pause in conversation, set down her glass with deliberate care and turned her attention toward Eliza, with the practiced innocence of a performer stepping into her rehearsed scene. "Miss Marsh," she said, her voice carrying easily across the table, "I do hope you will forgive my curiosity, but I have heard the most troubling account regarding your previous employment, before your aunt so generously took you in. Something about a dismissal, was it not, for dishonesty toward your former employer?" The table fell silent, every guest suddenly and intently focused on their plates, though every ear strained toward the exchange. Eliza felt her pulse hammering, but she kept her voice steady, drawing on the same discipline that had carried her through years of whispered cruelty in far smaller rooms than this one. "I have never been employed in any household, Lady Constance," she said clearly, "so I cannot imagine which former employer you refer to. Perhaps you have confused me with someone else, or perhaps whoever told you this story simply invented it, the way stories are so often invented when the truth proves inconvenient." A ripple of quiet interest moved through the table, several guests exchanging glances, and Lady Constance's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "How curious," she pressed on. "Then perhaps you might explain the matter of the gift you requested from the Duke, the book that once belonged to his late mother. I understand you asked for it quite directly, as payment, one might say, for your continued attentions." "I asked for nothing," Eliza said, her voice steady though her heart pounded fiercely against her ribs. "The Duke offered the book freely, as a gift given in kindness, and I would ask you, Lady Constance, precisely where you obtained such a detailed account of a private conversation that occurred within these very walls, since only 2 people were present for it, and neither of us has spoken a word of it to you." For the first time, Lady Constance's composure faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before she smoothed it away, but the damage of the hesitation had already registered around the table, several guests now watching her rather than Eliza, their expressions shifting from curiosity toward something closer to suspicion. The Duke, who had remained silent through the exchange, now rose slowly from his seat, and the entire table turned toward him as one, the room's attention shifting like a tide reversing direction. "Since Lady Constance has raised the matter herself," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that silenced every remaining whisper at the table, "perhaps this is the appropriate moment to clarify precisely how such private details came to be known outside the 2 people present for them. I have, this past week, spoken with a member of Lord Ashworth's household staff, who overheard a conversation between Lady Constance and Miss Charlotte Ellery, in which the details of Miss Marsh's private gift, and a fabricated account of her supposed dishonesty, were discussed and refined before being deliberately spread through this town." Gasps rippled through the room, and Charlotte Ellery's face drained of color entirely, her eyes darting toward Lady Constance as though seeking rescue that would not come. "That is a fabrication," Lady Constance said sharply, though her voice had lost the smooth confidence it carried moments before. Servants invent stories to please whoever questions them. You cannot possibly take the word of a housemaid over that of a woman of my standing. I would not, ordinarily, the Duke said, except that the housemaid in question has agreed to repeat her account before witnesses, should it prove necessary, and I have already taken the precaution of speaking with 2 other members of staff who corroborate the timing and substance of the conversation. I did not undertake this investigation lightly, Lady Constance. I undertook it because I would not allow a woman of genuine honesty to be destroyed by a fabrication designed by a woman who has never once, in my acquaintance with her, offered kindness where cruelty would serve her interests better. The silence that followed was absolute, every guest at the table frozen between shock and fascination, watching the season's reigning beauty unravel before their eyes with nothing left to defend herself but wounded pride. You would take her side, Lady Constance said, her voice rising now, cracking at the edges, over mine, over the word of a woman with connections and standing in this county, for the sake of some penniless nobody who wandered into a ballroom in her mother's old dress. I would take the side of truth, the Duke said simply, over the side of cruelty, regardless of whose dress is finer, or whose name carries more weight in this county. And I would remind you, Lady Constance, that this penniless nobody, as you call her, has faced 2 anonymous threats this week alone, delivered with clear intention to frighten her into silence, and has arrived here this evening despite them, while you sit at this table only now discovering that courage cannot be purchased with a title. Lady Constance rose abruptly from her seat, her chair scraping loudly against the floor in the silent room, and left the table without another word, Charlotte Ellery following close behind her. Both women's departure met with a silence far more damning than any accusation could have been. Eliza sat very still, her hands trembling now that the confrontation had passed, the adrenaline that had carried her through it beginning to ebb and leave something closer to exhaustion in its wake. The Duke turned to her, and in front of the entire remaining table, he did not lower his voice at all. I owe you an apology, he said, for allowing this to reach you at all, before I had gathered proof enough to end it cleanly. But I do not owe you an apology for anything else, Miss Marsh, and I would like every person at this table to understand plainly that my regard for you has never once wavered, and does not depend upon the good opinion of anyone who has tried this week to take it from you. Eliza felt tears gather, unbidden, at the corner of her eyes, though she fought to hold them back in front of so many watching faces. Your Grace, she managed, you did not need to say all of that here. I believe I did, he said, quietly now, meant only for her, because I intend to say a great deal more, though perhaps not in front of quite so full a dinner table, and I did not wish anyone in this room to imagine there remained a single doubt in my mind about the answer I intend to seek from you very soon. Lord Ashworth, visibly shaken by the scene that had unfolded at his own table, rose after a moment to offer a few careful words meant to steer the evening back toward some semblance of normalcy, thanking his guests for their patience and calling for the next course to be served. Conversation resumed slowly, in fits and starts, though the energy in the room had shifted entirely, every remaining guest now studying Eliza with an attention that felt, for the first time in weeks, closer to curiosity than judgment. Henry, seated further down the table, caught Eliza's eye and offered a small, approving nod, the first unreserved gesture of support he had given her since the whole affair began. Margaret dabbed quietly at her eyes with a handkerchief, overcome with an emotion she did not attempt to hide. Miss Marsh, one of the older guests near the head of the table said, a woman Eliza recognized as a distant connection of Lord Ashworth's own family, I confess I had believed the worst of you this past fortnight, having heard the story from more mouths than I could count. I find myself now rather ashamed of how quickly I accepted it, and I hope you will forgive an old woman's foolishness in repeating gossip she ought to have questioned more carefully. There is nothing to forgive, Eliza said, surprised and touched by the admission. We are none of us immune to believing what is repeated often enough and loudly enough. I am only grateful the truth found its way out before the damage became permanent. As the meal drew to its close and guests began to take their leave, several stopped to offer Eliza quiet words of apology or support, a slow trickle of small kindnesses that did more to steady her nerves than any single grand gesture could have accomplished. By the time she and the Duke stepped out into the cool evening air together, the worst of the evening's tension had finally begun to ease from her shoulders. That went rather better than I feared, the Duke said quietly, as they waited for the carriage to be brought round. Rather better than I feared as well, Eliza admitted, though I confess my knees have not yet fully recovered from the ordeal. He smiled, and reached to take her hand, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles in a gesture that felt far more intimate than anything spoken aloud that evening. You conducted yourself with more grace than anyone in that room deserved to witness, he said. I hope you know that whatever comes next, you have already proven yourself far stronger than any rumor Lady Constance could invent." Around them, the remaining guests exchanged glances heavy with unspoken understanding, and though the dinner resumed with careful, subdued conversation, Eliza understood that whatever had happened in Ashworth's dining hall that evening would be the story every drawing room in the county discussed for weeks to come, and this time, for the first time since the ball, the story would finally be true. 3 weeks passed before Eliza saw Lady Constance again, and when she did, it was not in a ballroom or a dining hall but on a quiet street corner, the woman's once immaculate composure now visibly frayed. Her greeting to passing acquaintances met more often with polite distance than the eager attention she had once commanded. The story of the dinner had traveled exactly as the Duke predicted, faster and further than any rumor Lady Constance herself had ever set in motion, and society, having once been so willing to believe cruelty, proved equally willing to punish the woman who had manufactured it. Charlotte Ellery had left the county entirely within a week of the dinner, retreating to a distant relative's estate rather than face the whispers that now followed her wherever she walked, and Eliza felt, upon hearing this news, not triumph, but something quieter and sadder, a recognition that both women had likely been shaped by disappointments of their own, long before either had ever set eyes on her. Lady Constance herself did not disappear quite so quickly, though her standing among the county's finest households diminished steadily with each passing week. Invitations that had once arrived without fail began to grow sparse, and the small court of admirers who had once surrounded her at every gathering thinned considerably, several of them having quietly attached themselves instead to hostesses less tainted by scandal. She was seen at church still, upright and composed as ever, though Eliza noticed, on the rare occasions their paths crossed, that fewer and fewer people troubled themselves to greet her warmly. Eliza took no particular satisfaction in this decline, though she would not have claimed complete indifference either. She had spent enough of her own life on the receiving end of cold shoulders and cutting whispers to understand precisely how heavy that kind of isolation could become, even for a woman who had done a great deal to earn it. For Eliza, the weeks that followed the dinner unfolded with a strange, careful gentleness she had not expected. The Duke called upon her often, and though the wider town continued to speak of little else, the tone of the conversation had shifted entirely, curiosity now outweighing cruelty, admiration slowly replacing suspicion. Her aunt, who had spent weeks bracing for disaster, began instead to receive a steady stream of invitations extended with newfound warmth, hostesses who had once overlooked the Whitfield household, now eager to include them, eager to claim some small proximity to the story unfolding at its center. Henry, too, appeared one afternoon with none of his earlier anger, offering instead an apology delivered with visible discomfort. "I judged you unfairly," he admitted, standing awkwardly near the parlor door. "I listened to men who wished only to see you fail, and I allowed their words to shape my own, before I had bothered to seek the truth myself. I am sorry for it, Eliza." Eliza accepted the apology with more grace than she perhaps felt he deserved, though she understood that fear, more than malice, had driven his earlier harshness, and she found she did not have the appetite to hold on to anger when so much of her life had finally begun to soften. The Duke's sister, Lady Helena, arrived at the Whitfield household one bright morning shortly after the news of the courtship had settled into something like accepted fact rather than scandal, and Eliza had approached the visit with considerable nervousness, aware that Julian valued his sister's opinion above almost anyone else's in his life. "I have heard a great deal about you," Lady Helena said, settling herself onto the settee with an ease that suggested she had already decided to like whatever she found, some of it cruel, most of it since proven false, and a small measure of it, I suspect, entirely true. "And which measure is that?" Eliza asked, bracing herself. "That my brother has not looked this content in the better part of 3 years," Lady Helena said, smiling now. "I came prepared to judge you harshly, Miss Marsh, out of loyalty to him, and I find I have very little material with which to do so. He speaks of you as though you have already become the steadiest part of his life, and having watched him endure the wreckage left by his last engagement, I confess I am relieved to see him so thoroughly recovered." The visit that followed passed far more easily than Eliza had anticipated, Lady Helena proving both sharp-witted and warm in equal measure, and by the time she departed, Eliza felt she had gained not merely her future husband's approval, but the beginnings of genuine friendship with the one relation whose opinion mattered most to him. It was on a mild evening in early autumn, the leaves just beginning to turn along the lane outside her aunt's house, that the Duke arrived without any prior word, dismissing his carriage entirely, and asking instead whether she might walk with him a short distance, alone, the request delivered with a quiet seriousness that immediately quickened her pulse. They walked together along the same lane where she had once feared to be seen at all, past neighbors who now offered warm greetings rather than whispered judgments, until they reached a small stretch of open field where the evening light had turned the grass to gold. "Do you remember?" he asked as they walked. "The promise I made you in the garden all those months ago, about the sea?" Eliza smiled at the memory. "I remember thinking it an impossible promise for a duke to make on a whim," she said. "I have arranged it," he said. "A house near the coast, not far from where my grandmother once lived, overlooking the water. I thought we might travel there together, once certain other matters between us are properly settled." "What other matters?" Eliza asked, though something in his tone told her she already suspected the answer. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression more serious now than she had seen it in weeks, serious in the particular way of a man who has rehearsed words carefully and fears he may still fumble them when the moment finally arrives. "I have thought a great deal," he said, stopping and turning to face her fully. "About the evening I first saw you standing near that column, wearing no jewels, expecting nothing from anyone in that room. I confess I have spent every day since trying to understand what it was that stopped me so completely in that moment. And I believe I have finally arrived at an answer." Eliza's breath caught, and she said nothing, waiting. "It was not your dress, or the absence of it," he continued. "It was the way you stood there, entirely yourself, without performance, without calculation, as though you had already decided that whatever the room thought of you mattered rather less than what you thought of yourself. I had spent years surrounded by women who understood exactly how to be seen by a duke. You were the first woman I had ever met who seemed entirely unconcerned with being seen by one at all." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet case, and Eliza's heart began to pound so hard she feared he might hear it. "I do not offer you jewels tonight," he said, opening the case to reveal a simple ring, elegant but understated, nothing like the elaborate settings worn by women such as Lady Constance. "I offer you instead the only thing I believe you have ever actually wanted from me, which is simply myself, honestly, without title or fortune standing between us as the reason. Eliza Marsh, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears rose freely now, and Eliza did not fight them. "Your Grace," she began, her voice unsteady. "Julian," he corrected gently. "I think, after everything we have weathered together, you might finally call me by my name." "Julian," she said, and the word felt strange and warm on her tongue, like stepping into a room she had never quite believed she would be permitted to enter. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly despite his usual composure, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, standing together in the golden field as the light softened toward evening. News of the engagement spread through the county within a single day, and this time, the whispers carried nothing but warmth. Invitations arrived from households that had once refused to acknowledge the Whitfield name at all. Even Lady Constance, upon hearing the news, was reported to have said nothing at all, her silence perhaps the truest measure of her defeat. The weeks that followed passed in a flurry of preparation, fittings and correspondence, and the slow, careful work of blending two households into one, and Eliza found herself, more often than not, simply grateful for the ordinary business of it all after months of scandal and uncertainty. Margaret took to the planning with an energy that surprised them both, insisting on overseeing every detail of the modest ceremony Eliza had requested, though Julian's own household staff pressed gently for something grander, more befitting a duke's wedding. "Let them have their grandeur where it matters least," Eliza told him one evening, when he raised the question of whether she might prefer a larger affair. "I would rather stand before the people who have actually stood beside me through the difficulty of this year, than fill a church with strangers simply because tradition demands it." Julian agreed without argument, and the guest list, when finally settled, proved considerably smaller than society expected of a ducal wedding, though no less meaningful for its size. Lord Ashworth was invited, along with the servant whose quiet courage had exposed Lady Constance's scheme, a gesture Eliza insisted upon despite some initial resistance from Julian's more traditional relations. "She deserves to see how her honesty changed the course of this," Eliza said firmly, and Julian, recognizing the particular set of her jaw that meant the matter was settled, did not argue further. In the final week before the wedding, Eliza received an unexpected letter from her father's old friend, a modest clergyman, who had known her family years before her father's death, offering warm congratulations, and recalling fondly the little girl who had once sat quietly in his church pews, asking endless questions about the stories in the stained glass windows. The letter brought unexpected tears, a reminder of the family she had lost, and the strange, winding path that had carried her from grief to this unlikely joy. The wedding took place before winter fully settled over the county, in the same church where Julian's own parents had married decades before. and Eliza stood at the altar in a gown of pale ivory, simple in its design, without a single jewel adorning her throat or her hair, exactly as she had stood in the ballroom the very first night he had seen her. The church itself had been decorated simply, at Eliza's request, with sprigs of late autumn greenery, rather than elaborate arrangements of hothouse flowers, and small candles lining the aisle that caught the afternoon light streaming through the old stained glass windows, scattering color across the stone floor in soft, shifting patterns. Margaret wept openly throughout the ceremony, and Henry, standing near the front pew, wore an expression of genuine pride that had replaced his earlier doubt entirely. Lady Helena sat near the front as well, dabbing occasionally at her eyes despite her earlier claims that she never wept at weddings, and beside her sat the housemaid, whose quiet testimony had turned the tide of the entire ordeal, dressed in her best gown, looking both proud and faintly overwhelmed to find herself included among such distinguished company. As Julian recited his vows, his voice steady despite the weight of the words, Eliza found herself thinking not of the grandeur of the church or the title she was about to inherit, but of the plain gray dress she had worn to her first ball, of the cold marble column she had hidden behind, of every whispered cruelty she had endured in the months since. None of it, she realized, had broken her. If anything, it had only clarified, with painful precision, exactly what she valued, and exactly who had proven themselves worthy of her trust. When it came time for her own vows, she spoke them clearly, her voice carrying through the quiet church without a single tremor, surprising even herself with the steadiness she found in that moment. "I promise you my honesty, always," she said, "even when it is difficult, even when silence would be easier. I promise you the truth of myself, without performance or pretense, exactly as you found me that first evening, and exactly as I intend to remain for the whole of our life together." Julian's eyes shone as she spoke, and when the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted into warmth rather than polite applause, Margaret's joyful weeping audible even over the sudden swell of the organ. When the ceremony ended and Eliza turned to face the gathered crowd as the new Duchess of Rendell, she caught sight of her own reflection in a nearby window, a woman in simple ivory, radiant not because of anything she wore, but because of everything she had refused to become in order to be loved. Outside the church, a small crowd of townsfolk had gathered to watch the couple emerge, many of them the very people who had once whispered cruelly about Eliza's supposed schemes, now calling out warm congratulations and well wishes as the newly married couple stepped into the crisp afternoon air. Eliza recognized several faces among them, the shopkeeper who had once offered only a stiff nod, the woman who had crossed the street rather than greet her, both now smiling and waving with what appeared to be genuine goodwill, as though the entire difficult season had simply washed away in the face of a happy ending everyone could agree upon. She did not hold their earlier coldness against them. She understood too well how easily fear and gossip could bend even well-meaning people toward unkindness, and she found she had little interest in carrying old grievances into the new chapter of her life that was only just beginning. Julian took her hand as they walked together down the aisle, and leaned close enough that only she could hear him. "No jewels," he murmured, smiling. Yet somehow, still the most striking woman in the room. Eliza laughed, the sound light and unguarded, and together they stepped out into the crisp autumn air, the whole county waiting to greet them, no longer as the poor niece and the untouchable duke, but simply as two people who had found, against every expectation placed upon them, that honesty had proven far more powerful than any fortune either of them might have offered instead. That evening, as the wedding festivities finally quieted, and the guests began to make their way home beneath a sky scattered with early stars, Eliza stood for a moment alone on the steps of Rendell Hall, looking back at the warm light spilling from every window, and allowed herself, at last, to simply feel the quiet, steady joy of a life she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. Julian found her there minutes later, and without a word, simply stood beside her, his hand finding hers in the cool evening air, both of them content, for once, to let the silence speak everything that needed saying. A carriage arrived at Rendell Hall without warning, on a cold February morning, nearly 4 months into Eliza's marriage, and the servant who announced the visitor wore an expression of such open surprise that Eliza set down her needlework immediately, sensing trouble before a single word had been spoken. The winter had settled comfortably over the estate by then, Eliza having grown accustomed to her new life with a speed that still occasionally surprised her, the vast rooms of Rendell Hall no longer feeling foreign but simply home, the servants no longer strangers but familiar faces who greeted her each morning with genuine warmth rather than wary curiosity. She had spent that particular morning by the fire with correspondence from Margaret, who wrote weekly now, full of news from the town and gentle reminders that she must not grow too grand to visit her old home from time to time. "Miss Charlotte Ellery is at the door, Your Grace," the servant said. "She asks whether you might spare her a few moments. She says she has nowhere else to turn." Julian, seated near the fire with a stack of correspondence, looked up sharply. "Send her away," he said. "She has caused enough harm in this house already." But Eliza rose before the servant could obey, something in the request giving her pause. "Wait," she said. "Let her in. I would like to hear what brings her here, after everything." Julian's jaw tightened, though he did not argue further, trusting her judgment even when his own instinct pulled toward refusal. Charlotte entered moments later, and the change in her was immediate and striking. Gone was the sharp, confident woman from the dinner months before. In her place stood someone thinner, paler, dressed in a traveling cloak that had seen better winters, her eyes red-rimmed from either cold or crying, perhaps both. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into an unsteady curtsy before Eliza. "Forgive my intrusion. I would not have come if I had any other option remaining to me." "Sit," Eliza said simply, gesturing toward a chair near the fire, her own curiosity now outweighing any lingering resentment. Charlotte hesitated, clearly startled by the kindness, before lowering herself into the offered seat. "My relative's patience with me has run out," she said quietly. "The estate where I have been staying since the autumn no longer wishes to house me, not after the scandal that followed Lady Constance's exposure attached itself to my name as well. I have no fortune, no prospects, and very few doors left open to me anywhere in England." "And you have come here," Julian said coldly, "to the one household you did the most to destroy." Charlotte flinched but did not look away. "Yes," she said, "because I do not know where else cruelty has not already reached before me, and because I remembered, that evening at the dinner, the way Miss Marsh spoke, even when she had every reason to hate me. I did not deserve her honesty then, I do not deserve her kindness now, but I had nowhere else left to try." Eliza studied her for a long moment, remembering her own years of standing at the edges of rooms, dismissed and unwanted, though her circumstances had never sunk quite so low as the woman now sitting before her. She thought of Julian's story about his first engagement, of a woman who had chosen calculation over honesty, and wondered how much of Charlotte's earlier cruelty had grown from fear rather than malice, fear of becoming exactly what she had now become, discarded and friendless. "Why did you help Lady Constance?" Eliza asked, not unkindly, only truthfully. Charlotte's composure finally broke, tears spilling freely down her face. "Because I was frightened," she said. "Frightened of what people would say once my own engagement failed. Frightened that I would be forgotten entirely unless I made myself useful to someone with more power than I had left. Lady Constance offered me a place at her side, and I was too afraid of being alone to ask whether the price of that place was one I could live with paying." "I understand fear better than most," Eliza said quietly, more to herself than to Charlotte. "I spent years afraid of being invisible, afraid of being forgotten in rooms full of people who never once troubled themselves to learn my name. I do not excuse what you did, but I recognize the fear that drove it, and I find I have little appetite for punishing a fear I have carried myself." Julian's expression remained guarded, but something in his posture eased slightly, the anger giving way, just slightly, to something closer to weary understanding. Eliza rose and crossed to the window, looking out over the frost-covered grounds of Rendell Hall, thinking carefully before she spoke again. "I will not pretend that what you did caused no harm," she said finally, turning back to face Charlotte. "It did. It frightened me terribly, and it very nearly cost me a future I had only just begun to hope for. But I understand, perhaps better than most, what it is to feel that the only way to survive in a room is to make yourself small, or in your case, to make yourself useful to someone crueler than yourself." Charlotte looked up, something like desperate hope flickering across her tear-streaked face. "I will not offer you a place in this household," Eliza continued, "and I will not pretend that trust, once broken so thoroughly, returns quickly. But I will speak with the Duke about securing you a modest position, perhaps as a companion to some elderly relation in a quieter county, far from the gossip that has followed you here, where you might begin again without the weight of Lady Constance's schemes hanging over every introduction you make." Julian's eyebrows rose slightly, surprise evident on his face, though he said nothing to contradict her. "Why would you help me?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After everything." "Because someone once looked past what the room expected of me and saw something worth trusting instead," Eliza said quietly. "I do not see why I should be the only person fortunate enough to receive that kindness." Charlotte left Rendell Hall an hour later, composed for the first time since her arrival, carrying with her a letter of introduction that Julian, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to write on Eliza's insistence, addressed to a distant aunt of his in Yorkshire, who required a quiet companion and cared little for county gossip. Once the carriage had departed down the long drive, Julian turned to Eliza with an expression somewhere between admiration and disbelief. "You are a better person than I am," he said. "I would have sent her away without a second thought." "Perhaps," Eliza said, slipping her hand into his, "but I remember too well what it felt like to have every door closed against me, before you were the one who chose to open one instead. I could not, in good conscience, close every door behind me now that I have finally been let through." Julian pressed a kiss to her forehead, quiet and grateful, and together they watched the last of the winter light fade over the frost-covered fields of the estate that was now, fully and completely, her home. Word of Charlotte's quiet departure to Yorkshire reached the county within days, though this time, no scandal attached itself to the telling. Instead, whispers of the new Duchess's grace toward a former enemy spread through drawing rooms with the same speed that cruelty once had, and slowly, steadily, the story of Eliza Marsh transformed once more, no longer merely the tale of a poor woman who had won a duke's heart, but the story of a woman whose honesty and kindness had proven, in the end, far more powerful than any title, any fortune, or any jewel that society had once believed she lacked. Months later, a brief letter arrived from Yorkshire, addressed to Eliza directly in Charlotte's careful hand. It said little of substance, only that the position had suited her better than she expected, that Julian's aunt was kind though occasionally difficult, and that she had found, in the quiet of the countryside, a measure of peace she had not believed herself capable of feeling again. She thanked Eliza once more for the kindness she had not earned, and closed the letter with a simple wish for continued happiness, signed only with her first name, without the flourish and performance that had once characterized everything she wrote and said. Eliza read the letter twice before setting it carefully in a drawer of her writing desk, feeling a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with triumph over an old rival, and everything to do with the simple, uncomplicated relief of having chosen mercy where cruelty would have been so much easier to justify. Lady Constance, for her part, was never seen in the county again. Some said she had retreated to a distant relation's home in the north. Others claimed she had married a minor landowner in Ireland, quietly and without ceremony, far from the glittering ballrooms where she had once reigned so completely. Eliza never learned the truth of it, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she no longer needed to know. Spring arrived early that year at Rendell Hall, the frost giving way to green well before the season's usual arrival, and Eliza often walked the same fields where Julian had once asked for her hand, watching the estate slowly bloom around her, thinking of the girl who had once stood in a plain gray gown, expecting nothing, and finding instead everything she had never dared to hope for. She wore no jewels still, more often than not, preferring simplicity even now that every ornament in England lay within her reach, and Julian, watching her from across whatever room they occupied, never once looked at her as though she needed them. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and the fires burned low, Eliza sometimes took out her father's worn book of poetry, the very gift Julian had once given her, and read a few lines aloud to him by the fire, both of them content in the simple, unremarkable happiness of an ordinary evening together, the kind of happiness neither scandal, nor jealousy, nor any cruelty society could invent had ever managed to take from them.